some sort of algorithm in the cuttlefish's mind that says, okay, if you see two spots, move your tentacles. So it can be, as you pointed out, it can be a fairly simple operation, but it looks diabolical. It looks cunning, but all it is strategy B.
Yeah, but it's still somehow emerged. I mean, I don't think that
Success.
calling it an algorithm doesn't. I feel like,
well, there's a circuit there that gets implemented in a certain context, but that circuit had to evolve.
You do realize super intelligent AI will look at us humans and will say the exact thing. There's a circuit in there that evolved to do this, the algorithm A and algorithm B, and it's trivial. And to us humans, it's fancy and beautiful and write poetry about it, but it's
because
just
we don't understand the subconscious. Because they want that AI algorithm cannot see into what it can't see. It doesn't understand the underworkings of what allows all of this conversation stuff to manifest. And we can't even see it. How could AI see it? Maybe it will. Maybe AI will solve and give us access to our subconscious. Maybe your AI friend or coach, like I think Andreessen and others are arguing is going to happen at some point. It's going to say, hey, Lex, you're making decisions lately that are not good for you, but it's because of this algorithm that you picked up in childhood that if you don't state your explicit needs up front, you're not going to get what you want. So why do it? From now on, you need to actually make a list of every absolutely outrageous thing that you want, no matter how outrageous, and communicate that immediately, and that will work.
We're talking about cuttlefish and sexual selection, and then we went into some. Where do we go?
Well,
and you said you were excited.
I was excited. Well, you were just saying, what about these covert contracts and animals do them? I think it's simple contextual engagement of a neural circuit, which is not just nerd speak for saying they do a different strategy. It's saying that there has to be a circuit there, a hardwired circuit, maybe learned, but probably hardwired, that can be engaged, right? You can't build neural machinery out of in a moment. You need to build that circuit over time. What is building it over time? You select for it. The cuttlefish that did not have that alternate context-driven circuit didn't survive when there was when all the shrimp that they normally eat disappear and the eye-spotted shrimp showed up. And there were a couple that had some miswiring. This is why mutation, right? The X-Men stuff is real. They had a mutation that had some alternate wiring, and that wiring got selected for. It became a mutation that was adaptive as opposed to maladaptive. This is something people don't often understand about genetics, is that it only takes a few generations to devolve a trait, make it worse, but it takes a long time to evolve an adaptive trait. There are exceptions to that, but most often that's true. So a species needs a lot of generations. We are hopefully still evolving as a species, and it takes a long time, but to evolve more adaptive traits. But it doesn't take long to devolve adaptive traits so that you're getting sicker or you're not functioning as well. So choose your mate wisely, and that's perhaps a good segue into sexual selection.
I can tell you're good at this. Why did I bring up sexual selection? It's the relationship. So sexual selection in humans. I don't think you've done an episode on relationships.
No, I did an episode on attachment.
Right.
But not on relationships. The series with Conti includes one episode of the 4 that's all about relational understanding and how to select a mate based on matching of drives.
And all the demons inside the subconscious, how to match demons, that they dance well together, or what?
And how generative two people are.
What does that mean?
Means that how, the way he explains it is how devoted to creating growth within the context of the family, the relationship with work.
Well, let me ask you about mating rituals and how to find such a relationship. I mean, you're really big on friendships, on the value of friendships.
I am.
I think it extends itself into one of the deepest kinds of friendships you can have, which is a romantic relationship. What mistakes, successes, and wisdom can you impart?
I've certainly made some mistakes. I've also made some choices in this realm. First of all, we have to define what sort of relationship we're talking about. If one is looking for a life partner, potentially somebody to established family with or without kids, with or without pets, right? Families can take different forms. I mean, I certainly experienced being a family in a prior relationship where it was the two of us and our two dogs, and it was family. We had a little family. I think, based on my experience and based on input from friends who themselves have very successful relationships, I must say I've got friends who are in long-term, monogamous, very happy relationships where there seems to be a lot of love, a lot of laughter, a lot of challenge, and a lot of growth. And both people, it seems, really want to be there and enjoy being there.
Just to pause on that, one thing to do, I think, by way of advice, is listen to people who are in long-term successful relationships. That's like, that seems dumb, but like we both know and are friends with Joe Rogan, who's been in a long-term, really great relationship, and he's been an inspiration to me. So you take advice from that guy.
Definitely. And several members of my podcast team are in excellent relationships. I think one of the things that rings true over and over again in the advice and in my experience is find someone who's really a great friend. Like, build a really great friendship with that person. Now, obviously not just a friend if we're talking romantic relationship, but and of course sex is super important, but it should be a part of that particular relationship alongside or meshed with the friendship. Can it be a majority of the positive exchange? I suppose it could, but I think the friendship piece is extremely important, because what's required in a successful relationship clearly is joy in being together, trust, a desire to share experience, both mundane and more adventurous, support each other, acceptance, a real maybe even admiration, but certainly delight in being with the person. Earlier we were talking about peace, and I think that sense of peace comes from knowing that the person you're in friendship with, or that you're in a romantic relationship, or ideally both, because let's assume the best romantic relationship includes a friendship component with that person. It's like you just really delight in their presence, even if it's a quiet presence. And you delight in seeing them delight in things, right? That's clear. The trust piece is huge, and that's where people start. We don't want to focus on what works, not what doesn't work, but that's where I think people start engaging these covert contracts. They're afraid of being betrayed, so they betray. They're afraid of giving up too much vulnerability, so they hide their vulnerability. Or in the worst cases, they feign vulnerability. Again, that's a covert contract that just simply undermines everything. It becomes vulnerable. It's 1 = 2 - 1 to infinity. Conversely, I think if people can have really hard conversations, this is something I've had to work really hard on in recent years, and that I'm still working hard on. But the friendship piece seems to be the thing that rises to the top when I talk to friends who are in these great relationships. There's so much respect and love and joy in being with their friend. Is the person that they want to spend as much of their non-working, platonic friendship time with, and the person that they want to experience things with and share things with. And it sounds so kind of canned and cliche nowadays, but I think if you step back and examine how most people go about finding a relationship, so I'm like, am I attracted? Of course, physical attraction is important, and other forms of attraction too. And you sort of enter through that portal, which makes sense. That's the mating dance, right? That's the peacock situation. That's hopefully not the cuttlefish situation. But I think that there seems to be a history of people close to me getting into great relationships where they were friends for a while first, or maybe didn't sleep together right away. Yeah. That they actually intentionally deferred on that. This has not been my habit or my experience. I've gone the more, I think, typical like, oh, there's a attraction, like this person, there's an interest, you're going to explore all dimensions of the relationship really quickly, except perhaps the moving in part and the having kids part, which I feel like is the bigger step, harder to undo without more severe consequences. But I think the whole take it slow thing, I don't think is about getting to know someone slowly. I think it's about that physical piece, because that does change the nature of the relationship. And I think it's because it gets right into the more hardwired primitive circuitry around the feelings of safety, vulnerability. There's something about romantic or sexual interactions where it's almost like it's like assets and liability, right? Where people are trying to figure out how much to engage their time and their energy and multiple. I'm talking about from both sides, male, female, or whatever sides, but where it's like assets and liabilities, and that's where it starts getting like into those complicated contracts early on, I think. And so maybe that's why if a really great friendship and admiration is established first, even if people are romantically and sexually attracted to one another, then that piece can be added in a little bit later in a way that really kind of just seals up the whole thing. And then who knows, maybe they spend 90% of their time having sex. I don't know. That's not for me to say or decide, obviously. But there's something there about staying out of a certain amount of risk of having to engage covert contract in order to protect oneself.
But I do think like love at first sight, this kind of idea is in part realizing very quickly that you are great friends. Like I've had that experience of friendship recently. Just it's not really friendship, but like, oh, you get each other with humans, not in a romantic setting.
Right, friendship.
Yeah, just friendship, but not.
Dare I say, I felt that way when we met, right?
But we also
I was like, this dude's cool, and he's smart, and he's funny, and he's driven, and he's giving, and he's got an edge, and like I want to learn from him, want to hang out with him. Like, that was the beginning of our friendship. Was essentially, that set of.
Вот он! Вон он! Вон он, блядь, ебанство! Пацаны, да он там совсем ёбу дал! Палить надо его! Пацаны, сейчас накроют нас! Вон он, сука! Сюда ко мне! Вон он, сука! Пора! Stupid!
Right. That was annoying.
Of internal
Just
realizations.
keep going. Just keep going. Like, keep going.
And a
with these
sharp
compliments.
dresser. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and,
Just
you
looks
know,
great shirtless on horseback. Yes.
No. Listen, I mean, it's despite what some people might say on the internet, it's a purely platonic friendship.
Somebody said, somebody asked if Andrew Huberman has a girlfriend, and somebody says, "I think so." And the third comment was, "This really like breaks my heart, like that Lex and Andrew are not not an item."
We are not. We are great friends, but we are not an item.
Yeah,
It's true.
well.
It's official. The I hear over and over again from friends that have made great choices and awesome partners and have these fantastic relationships for long periods of time that seem to continue to thrive. At least that's what they tell me, and that's what I have observed. Establish the friendship first and give it a bit of time for sex. And so, you know, I think that's the feeling. That's the feeling. And we're talking micro features and macro features. We're talking, you know, and this isn't about perfection. It's actually about the imperfections, which is kind of cool. I like quirky people. I like characters. I'll tell you where I've gone badly wrong, where I see other people going badly wrong. If there is no rule that says that you have to be attracted to all attractive people by any means, it's very important to develop a sense of taste in romantic attractions. I believe what you really like in terms of a certain style, you know, a certain way of being, and of course that includes sexuality and sex itself, the verb. But I think it also includes their just general way of being, you know, and when you really adore somebody, you like the way they answer the phone. And when they don't answer the phone that way, you know something's off and you want to know. And so I think that the more you can tune up your powers of observation, not looking for things that you like, and the more that stuff just kind of washes over you, the more likely you are to quote unquote fall in love. As a mutual friend of ours said to me, you know, listen, when it comes to romantic relationships, if it's not 100% in you, it ain't happening. And I've never seen a violation of that statement where it's like, it's mostly good and they're this, and there's like the negotiations. Well, already it's doomed. And that doesn't mean someone has to be perfect. The relationship has to be perfect, but it's got to feel 100% inside. Yeah. Like yes, and yes. I think Diceroff, when he was on here, your podcast, mentioned something that, you know, like, I think the words were, or maybe it was in his book, I don't recall, but that, you know, love is one of these things that we story into with somebody. We create this idea of ourselves in the future, and we look at our past time together, and then you story into it. I mean, there are very few things like that. I can't story into, you know, building flying cars. I have to actually go do something. I mean, and love is also retroactively constructed. I mean, anyone who's gone through a breakup understands the grief of knowing, like this is something I really shouldn't be in for whatever reason, because it only takes one. If the other person doesn't want to be in it, then you shouldn't be in it. But then missing so many things, and that's just the attachment machinery really at work.
I have to ask you a question that somebody on our amazing team wanted to ask. He's happily married. Another, like you mentioned, incredible relationship.
Are they good friends?
Are they amazing friends?
There you go.
But says, I'm not saying who it is, so I can say some stuff, which is it started out as a great sexual connection.
Oh, well, there you go.
But then became very close friends after that.
Listen.
There you go. So speaking of sex,
many paths to Rome.
He has a wonderful son, and he's wanting to have a second kid, and he wanted to ask the great Andrew Huberman, is there like sexual positions or any kind of thing that can help maximize the chance that they have a girl versus a boy? Because they had a wonderful boy, they want a girl. Is there a way to control the gender?
Well, this has been debated for a long time, and I did a 4.5-hour episode on fertility. And the reason I did a 4.5-hour episode on fertility is that, first of all, I find the reproductive biology be fascinating, and I wanted a resource for people that were thinking about or struggling with having kids for whatever reason. And it felt important to me to combine the male and female components in the same episode. It's all timestamped, so you don't have to listen to the whole thing. We talk about IVF, in vitro fertilization. We talk about natural pregnancy. Okay, the data on position is very interesting. But let me just say a few things. There are a few clinics now, in particular some out of the United States, that are spinning down sperm and finding that they can separate out fractions, as they're called. They can spin the sperm down at a given speed, and they'll separate out at different sort of depths within the test tube that allow them to pull out the sperm on top or below and bias the probability towards male or female births. It's not perfect. It's not 100%. It's a very costly procedure. It's still very controversial. Now, with in vitro fertilization, you can extract eggs. You can introduce a sperm directly by pipette. It's a process called ICSI, or you can set up a sperm race in a dish. And if you get a number of different embryos, meaning the eggs get fertilized to duplicate and start to form a blastocyst, which is a ball of cells, early embryo, then you can do karyotyping. So you can look for XX or XY, select the XY, which then would give rise to a male offspring, and implant that one. So there is that kind of sex selection. With respect to position, there's a lot of lore that, if the woman is on top or the woman's on the bottom, or whether or not the penetration is from behind, whether or not it's going to be male or female offspring. And frankly, the data are not great, as you can imagine, because those would be interesting studies to run, perhaps.
But there is studies, there is papers.
But
they're not, I guess.
Yeah,
there's more lore than science.
And there are a lot of other variables that are hard to control. So, for instance, if it's ejaculation during intromission, during sex, penetration, etc., then you can't measure, for instance, sperm volume, as opposed to when it's IVF, and they can actually measure how many milliliters, how many forward motile sperm. It's hard to control for certain things, and which can vary between individuals and even from one ejaculation to the next. And okay, so there's too many variables. However, the position thing is interesting in the following way, and then I'll answer whether or not you can bias towards a female. Okay. As long as we're talking about
I have other questions about sex.
But as long as we're talking about sexual position,
all right.
There are data that support the idea that in order to increase the probability of successful fertilization, that indeed the woman should not stand upright after sex, and should right after the man has ejaculated inside her, and should adjust her pelvis, say 15 degrees upwards. I mean, some of the fertility experts, MDs, will say that's crazy, but others that I sought out, and not specifically for this answer, but for researching that episode, said that, what you're talking about is trying to get the maximum number of sperm, and it's contained in semen, and yes, the semen can leak out. And so keeping the pelvis tilted at 15 degrees for about 15 minutes, obviously tilted in the direction that would have things running upstream, not downstream, so to speak, gravity, it's real. So for maximizing fertilization, the doctors I spoke to just said, look, given that if people are trying to get pregnant, what is spending 15 minutes on their back? This sort of thing. Okay, so then with respect to getting a female offspring, or XX female offspring, selectively, there is the idea that as fathers get older, they're more likely to have daughters as opposed to sons. That's from the papers I've read, is a significant but still mildly significant result. So with each passing year, this person increases the probability they're going to have a daughter, not a son. But look, so that's interesting.
But the probability differences are probably tiny.
I mean, it's not, it's not trivial. Mm-hmm. It's not a trivial difference.
Match found.
But if they want to ensure having a daughter, then they should do IVF and select an XX embryo. And when you go through IVF, they genetically screen them for karyotype, which is XXXY. And they look at mutations, genotypic mutations, for things like trisomies and aneuploidies, all the stuff you don't want.
But there is a lot of lore if you look on the internet.
Sure, different foods.
So there are a lot of variables.
There's a lot of variables, but there haven't been systematic studies. So I think probably the best thing to do, unless they're going to do IVF, is just roll the dice. And I think with each passing year, they increase the probability of getting a female offspring. But of course, with each passing year, the egg and sperm quality degrade. So get after it soon.
So I went down a rabbit hole. There's like sexology. There's journals.
Oh yeah,
on sex.
Sure.
Okay, so
sure. Some of them, not all, quite reputable.
Yeah.
And some of them really pioneering in the sense that they've taken on topics that are, considered, outside the main frame of what people talk about, but they're very important. We have episodes coming out soon with, for instance, the head of male urology, sexual health, and reproductive health at Stanford, Michael Eisenberg, but also, one with a female urologist, sexual health, reproductive health, Dr. Rena Malik, who has a quite active YouTube presence. She does these really dry, scientific presentation, but very nice. She has a lovely voice, but she'll be talking about erections or squirting or all this. She does very kind of internet type content. But she's a legitimate urologist, reproductive health expert. And in the podcast, we did talk about both male and female orgasm. We talked a lot about sexual function, dysfunction. We talked a lot about pelvic floor. One interesting factoid is that only 3% of sexual dysfunction is hormonal, endocrine in nature. It's more often.
The following is a conversation with Yosha Bach, his third time on this podcast. Yosha is one of the most brilliant and fascinating minds in the world, exploring the nature of intelligence, consciousness, and computation. And he's one of my favorite humans to talk to about pretty much anything and everything. And now, a quick few second mention of each sponsor. Check them out in the description. It's the best way to support this podcast. We got Numerai for the world's hardest data science tournament, 8 Sleep for naps, Masterclass for learning, and AG1 for health. Choose wisely, my friends. Also, if you want to work with our amazing team, we're always hiring. Go to lexfriedman.com/hiring. And now, onto the full ad reads. As always, no ads in the middle. I try to make this interesting, but if you must skip them, please still check out our sponsors. I enjoy their stuff. Maybe you will too. This show is brought to you by Numerai, a hedge fund that uses AI and machine learning to make investment decisions. It's basically a super difficult machine learning tournament that uses real data. Submitted models.
What's up?
What's up?
Difficult real world data sets. You may know that for a long time and still
Where we're going?
interested in real world robotics. One of the largest scale.
Come down. I'm gonna knife B then.
Vehicles.
I'll knife towards window side so I can get window maybe too.
Same is true for financial markets. And so it's really interesting that Numerai presents to you the real world data of
You want me
financial
to smoke
markets
rush
and
window?
presents you an easy, accessible mechanism by which to test, deploy, and compete with others on this kind of data set. So it's a really great way if you're interested in data science and machine learning to learn, compete, to have fun, all that kind of stuff. Head over to numer.ai/Lex to sign up for a tournament and hone your machine learning skills. That's numer.ai/Lex for a chance to play against me and win a share of the tournament's prize. This episode is also brought to you by 8 Sleep.
You guys can leave.
New pod
One's on C though. We should kind of go C.
Scorching
Let Raina
Texas
lurk up
heat.
a little bit more.
The thing I go to escape. Escape nature. For the external harsh conditions of nature. And go into the nature of my own mind.
Can we come back to 8?
Wherever that weird and beautiful dream
They're
world
flanking,
is,
they're flanking.
the place that has no rules,
Killjoy's 5 HP.
Player standing.
no limits,
What
Spike
is
down,
Omen?
C.
no
Killjoy's
physics,
5.
no constraints on what is possible and what is impossible.
Heal off the bitch right
Dream
away.
world that we go to. What is that world?
That's a ghost.
It's the same world as imagination. It's such
30
a
seconds
fascinating
left.
world. The human mind, its capabilities are just so incredibly fascinating, and one of the ways to explore that dream. But it's the return from the dream world.
One enemy remaining.
I love naps. It's a quick stroll to the dream world and you're back.
10
Taking on
seconds
the
left.
challenges of the day in the here and now. Anyway, if you're into naps as much as me, you should check out 8 Sleep. And you'll get special savings when you go to 8sleep.com/flex.
All good. Into.
Amen.
This show is also brought to you by Masterclass. $10 a month gets you an all.
Was there one on B that round?
To watch courses
One
from the
flank
best
from B and
people
one
in
flank
the
from
world
C.
in their respective disciplines.
Okay.
The list of courses I've personally watched and enjoyed just lasts forever, but they have everybody and anybody you ever want to listen to.
I'm gonna arrow here
I
so
listened
that
to
if
Marcus
someone walks
Scorsese,
down
Tony
short,
Hawk,
they're
Jake
gonna get
Goodall,
fucked.
Neil Gaiman, Daniel Negreanu before I interviewed him, Garrett Kasparov, Carlos Santana, Will Wright, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Chris Hadfield. The list is incredible. I'm a huge believer. Learning about a thing, every part of learning about a thing should involve learning or listening to the best people in the world at that thing.
Come short and I'll bait.
It's not only the advice they give,
Player
it's not
standing.
only the analysis or the
Spike down
description
A.
of how they approach this thing, but in the way they see
Worth
life,
it? What the fuck?
in the way they carry
That's a lot of
themselves
guns.
physically and mentally. You get to watch mastery. And it's so beautiful that human beings are able to reach the very top of excellence. And sometimes break through the boundaries, the limits of what was thought possible before. And it's just beautiful to watch those humans.
Alright, we play slow until we see something
Great to
because we don't want to
celebrate
run
that
into
courage
bullshit with
to
their
learn
low,
from that. Anyway,
like
get
shorties
unlimited
and
access
whatever.
to every masterclass and get
Yep.
15% off an annual membership at masterclass.com/flex.
I'm flashing and
That's
arrowing mid.
masterclass.com/flex. This show is brought to you by AG1. Their all-in-one daily drink brings happiness.
3C, don't go.
And daily, for me, is twice daily. It brings happiness, health.
Hey, I'm going A.
all the crazy
You guys can come with me.
mental stuff I do. It's built on a foundation, basic
Fade and
nutritional health.
Brimmercy.
It's the super multivitamin that I use. It also is one of the components of daily habits that I have in my
I have
life.
alt now.
So whenever I do this thing, I feel grounded. I feel happy. I feel like I have my life together. So you can do
One
that
heaven.
both at home and
Heaven's spots about to drop.
traveling. In fact, it's one
One
of the things that
enemy
makes me
remaining.
feel like I'm at home when I'm traveling. I'll drink an AG1 and
Nice, good round.
it put a smile on my face. It's green, tastes delicious. What else do you want? They'll give you a 1-month supply of fish oil when you sign
they take
up
Icebox
at
out of ranked?
AG1.com/.
Yeah.
A long time
It's
ago.
tragic.
This is
Let's
the
go
Lex
again,
Friedman
please.
podcast. To support it,
I
check
see.
out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends,
Breeze is coming
here's your
back
show.
though.
Oh, I don't want that. That shit's whack. I'm glad they took out Breeze. Icebox is fun.
Still inside.
You wrote a post about levels of resilience. Quote, as we grow older, it becomes
We don't have to go.
Our self-reflexive mind is not just gradually accumulating ideas about itself, but that it progresses in somewhat distinct stages.
Spike down. C.
So there's 7 of the stages. Stage 1, reactive survival, infant. Stage 2, personal self, young child. Stage
I'm
3,
bad.
social self, adolescent, domesticated adult. Stage 4 is rational agency.
He ulted for 1 kill though.
Stage 5 is self-authoring. That's full result. You've achieved wisdom, but there's 2 more stages. Stage 6 is enlightenment.
If you're not a good shot today, don't worry. There are other ways to be useful.
Force it one more time.
Let's just go through. I don't think we need to be that scared without KJ being on site.
Yeah, I'm down.
Flashes.
I'm gonna knife B though.
Right here.
I'll paranoia on this.
He's 1 HP on B.
Spike down. C. standing.
Did you guys not see Phoenix cross?
I'm out. Let's go. I got
Oh, he
things
goes
to
there
do.
before us.
They're not better than me.
I'm knifing your short.
Fire in the hole! Oops, my ult.
We got 2A, we can go in.
Yeah, I'm down. Marina, careful, careful, careful. Marina, give me mid, give me mid. Other guns? Don't throw, please.
This one have it. Smoke and fight.
One heaven.
Stealing sight. One enemy remaining.
He's running away.
Save, save, save.
So meaningless. Might as well.
Are we just gonna commit C? Phoenix often fights it, so if we walk and then swing at the same time, we'll kill him. But, like, let's walk it for like first 2 seconds, you know? Swing. Wait, fade left then.
You should run. Last
spike
player
player is killed.
standing. Spike down. C.
Bro, we gotta commit somewhere. We can't just be sitting there and letting them take map control. We don't even have sentinels.
I didn't hear anything you just said.
We have to like commit somewhere. If we just sit there, they're just gonna flank us. We don't have any sentinels. It's just
agreed,
taking
agreed.
space.
If you don't want to commit, it's fine. Just default.
Let's go.
He's pushing our mid. He's mid.
Careful here.
Push window.
Spike down. A. One enemy remaining.
One inch, 80, 80, 80, 80, 80. Just
Okay.
go away, yeah.
Last player standing. My ult ready.
got this.
Right here.
I'm flashing mid.
Take flight.
I'm with you right now.
Blocking sight. Face your fear!
We don't have to go. I would rather not go.
I'll
You
arrow,
pass
just
spike.
wait.
Hold far wide. I'm holding close.
Spike down. C. Last.
Dude, why are
player
you going
standing.
up with the spike with an Odin?
Redemption time. Ah,
Have a single life worth saving.
My ult's ready. What's this?
One long, one long, one long. He's left. We don't have to go. Let's leave. Can I have a classic right now? Wait 8 seconds and I have knife. Okay.
Reloading.
Joke's over! You're dead!
30 seconds left.
One mid. Two mid. Two garage. One CT.
Fire in the hole!
Oh.
Player standing. One enemy remaining.
CT. Out. Out.
Act on my
Because they have a KJ, they know when we're not pushing, we have to like at least break the KJ util before like, defaulting again.
Are you guys a 3-stack or something?
Who?
No, the other 3, bro. Okay.
Deploying drone.
One suppressed.
Shock down.
Two flank.
Last player standing.
She knows. What? This is so stupid.
Flawless. Last round in the half.
This game sucks because it's full of hackers, man.
Map deployed. Spike retrieved.
My ult is ready. I am the hunter.
Fragment.
Side should be clear, side should be clear. Go in, side should be clear.
One enemy remaining.
Still inside.
Switching sides.
There.
I'm knifing A, I mean.
Help. Help.
You want me to fight with you?
Yes.
Alright, I'm knifing. And then we can swing together. I'll hold like right after I throw my thing, window. Unless he's smoking it. No, he's not.
Father.
All of them.
That is for sure hacks. That is 100%. Like, so obvious. I'm so done with this game, man.
Spike planted. Last player standing.
Just let them try to catch me.
So stupid.
See, I'll see.
They're gonna have KJ watching flank.
Spike planted. Last player standing.
I got your backs. Just, you know, from the front.
It is hacking. 100%. She hit me 6 times and killed Reyna. There? That makes no sense. Unless Reyna was dead. Still.
I'm not mid with you, Jet. Just so you know. Okay. Get one right now. You're good for one at least. Good stuff.
Spike down A.
Oh my god, you guys are beautiful. That's exactly what we need.
Reloading.
Flashbang.
One enemy remaining. There.
Knife deployed.
My ult's ready.
Dang, that sucks.
Cover going out.
Wind, show me where to go.
Can I have your Deagle, Silva?
Your fault.
Yeah. Reyna should fight that 100% of the time.
Oh my, can you smoke mid so I can get Jet's gun? Omen?
I don't know smokes. This game sucks. كانش الليل ما تسمع شو ستوب. That's too bad. Flash is banned every time, so is Jackal.
Seconds to insertion. 5 seconds to go. Your mission is to locate and defuse a bomb.
Changing mags.
This guy's getting my fucking way, man.
Time to make a new door. It's about to get hot.
Stay sharp.
Located a bomb. Take cover. It's hot.
So dumb.
Operator remaining. 15 seconds. 10 seconds left.
I hate this map. Just no.
5 seconds. Time limit reached.
Stage 7 is transcendence. Can you explain each or the interesting parts of each of these stages? And what's your sense why there are stages of this, of lucidity as we progress through life in this too short life?
This model is derived from a concept by the psychologist Robert Keegan, and he talks about the development of the self as a process that happens in principle by some kind of reverse engineering of the mind, where you gradually become aware of yourself and thereby build structure that allows you to interact deeper with the world and yourself. And I found myself using this model not so much as a developmental model. I'm not even sure if it's a very good developmental model because I saw my children not progressing exactly like that. And I also suspect that you don't go through these stages necessarily in succession, and it's not that you work through one stage and then you get into the next one. Sometimes you revisit them, sometimes stuff is happening in parallel. But it's, I think, a useful framework to look at what's present in the structure of a person and how they interact with the world and how they relate to themselves. So it's more like a philosophical framework that allows you to talk about how minds work. And at first, when we are born, we don't have a personal self yet, I think. Instead, we have an attentional self, and this attentional self is initially in the infant tasked with building a world model, and also an initial model of the self. But mostly it's building a game engine in the brain that is tracking sensory data and uses it to explain it. And in some sense you could compare it to a game engine like Minecraft or so the colors and sounds. People are all not physical objects. They are creations of our mind at a certain level of coarse graining. Models that are mathematical, that use geometry and that use information of objects and so on to create scenes in which we can find ourselves and interact with them.
So Minecraft.
Yeah, and this personal self is something that is more or less created after the world is finished, after it's trained into the system, after it has been constructed. And this personal self is an agent that interacts with the outside world. And the outside world is not the world of quantum mechanics, it's not the physics universe, but it's the model that's been generated in our own mind. Right, and this is us, and we experience ourselves interacting with that outside world that is created outside of our own mind. And outside of ourselves, there's feelings, and they presented our interface to this outside world. They pose problems to us. These feelings are basically attitudes that our mind is computing, that tell us what's needed in the world, the things that we are drawn to, the things that we are afraid of. And we are tasked with solving this problem of satisfying the needs, avoiding the aversions, following on our inner commitments and so on, and also modeling ourselves and building the next stage. So after we have this personal self in stage 2 online, many people form a social self. And this social self allows the individual to experience themselves as part of a group. It's basically this thing that when you are playing in a team, for instance, you don't notice yourself just as a single node that is reaching out into the world, but you're also looking down. You're looking down from this entire group and you see how this group is looking at this individual, and everybody in the group is in some sense emulating this group spirit to some degree. And in this state, people are forming their opinions by assimilating them from this group mind. They basically gain the ability to act a little bit like a hive mind.
But are you also modeling the interaction of how opinion shapes and forms through the interaction of the individual nodes within the group?
Yeah, it's basically the way in which people do it in this stage is that they experience what are the opinions of my environment. They experience the relationship that they have to their environment, and they resonate with people around them, and get more opinions in this through this interaction, through the way in which they relate to others. And at stage 4, you basically understand that stuff is true and false independently people believe, and you have agency over your own beliefs in that stage. You basically discover epistemology, the rules about determining what's true and false.
So you start to learn how to think.
Yes. I mean, at some level, you're always thinking, you are constructing things. And I believe that this ability to reason about your mental representation is what we mean by thinking. It's an intrinsically reflexive process that requires consciousness. Without consciousness, you cannot think. You can generate the content of feelings and so on outside of consciousness. It's very hard to be conscious of how your feelings emerge, at least in the early stages of development. But thoughts is something that you always control.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a nerd like me, you often have to skip stage 3 because you lack the intuitive empathy with others. Because in order to resonate with a group, you need to have a quite similar architecture. And if people are wired differently, then it's hard for them to resonate with other people and basically have empathy, which is not the same as compassion, but it is a shared perceptual mental state. Empathy happens not just via inference about the mental states of others, but it's a perception of what other people feel and where they're at.
Can't you not have empathy while also not having a similar architecture, cognitive architecture as the others in the group?
I think, yes, but I experienced that too, but you need to build something that is like a meta-architecture. You need to be able to embrace the architecture of the other to some degree, or find some shared common ground. And it's also this issue that if you are a nerd, normies often, so people, basically neurotypical people, have difficulty to resonate with you. And as a result, they have difficulty understanding you unless they have enough wisdom to feel what's going on there.
Well, isn't the whole process of the stage 3s to figure out the API to the other humans that have different architecture, and you yourself publish public documentation for the API that people can interact with for you? Isn't this the whole process of socializing?
My experience as a child growing up was that I did not find any way to interface with the stage 3 people, and they didn't do that with me. So
Did you try?
Yeah, of course, I tried it very hard. But it was only when I entered a mathematics school at 9th grade, lots of other nerds were present, that I found people that I could deeply resonate with, and had the impression that, yes, I have friends now, I found my own people. And before that, I felt extremely lonely in the world. There was basically nobody I could connect to. And I remember there was one moment in all these years where I was in, there was a school exchange, and there was a Russian boy, kid from the Russian garrison stationed in Eastern Germany, who visited our school, and we played a game of chess against each other. And we looked into each other's eyes, and we sat there for 2 hours playing this game of chess. And I had the impression this is the human being. He understands what I understand. We didn't even speak the same language.
I wonder if your life could have been different if you knew that it's okay to be different, to have a different architecture. Whether like accepting that the interface is hard to figure out, takes a long time to figure out, and it's okay to be different. In fact, it's beautiful to be different.
It was not my main concern. My main concern was mostly that I was alone. Right? It was not so much the question, is it okay to be the way I am? I couldn't do much about it, so I had to deal with it. But my main issue was that I was not sure if I would ever meet anybody growing up that I would connect to at such a deep level that I would feel that I could belong.
So there's a visceral, undeniable feeling of being alone.
Yes. And I noticed the same thing when I came into the math school, that I think at least half, probably 2/3 of these kids were severely traumatized as children growing up, and in large part due to being alone, because they couldn't find anybody to relate to.
Don't you think everybody's alone, deep down?
No. Also, I'm not alone. I'm not alone anymore. It took me some time to update and to get over the traumata and so on, but I felt that in my 20s I had lots of friends and I had my place in the world, and I had no longer doubts that I would never be alone again.
Is there some aspect to which we're alone together? You don't see a deep loneliness inside yourself still?
No.
You have not enough
Sorry.
base is under attack.
Okay, so that's the non-linear progression through the stages, I suppose. You caught up on stage 3 at some point?
So we were at stage 4. And so basically I find that many nerds jump straight into stage 4, bypassing stage 3.
Did they return to it then later?
Yeah, of course. Sometimes they do, not always.
Yeah.
The question is basically, do you stay a little bit autistic or do you catch up? And I believe you can catch up. You can build this missing structure and basically experience yourself as part of a group, learn intuitive empathy, and develop the perceptual sense of feeling what other people feel. And before that, I could only basically feel this when I was deeply in love with somebody and we synced, or...
So there's a lot of friction to feeling that way. Like it only with certain people, as opposed to it comes naturally.
Yeah.
It's frictionless.
But this is something that basically later I felt started to resolve itself for me, to a large degree.
What was the trick?
In many ways, growing up and paying attention. Meditation did help. I had some very crucial experiences in getting close to people, building connections, cuddling a lot in my student years.
So really paying attention
Yeah.
to the, what is it, to the feeling another human being feeling.
Loving other people and being loved by other people, and building a space in which you can be safe and can experiment and touch a lot and be close to somebody a lot. And over time, basically, at some point you realize, oh, it's no longer that I feel locked out, but I feel connected and I experience where somebody else is at. And normally my mind is racing very fast at a high frequency, so it's not always working like this. Sometimes it works better, sometimes it works less. But I also don't see this as a pressure. It's interesting to observe myself, which frequency I'm at and at which mode somebody else is at.
Yeah, man, the mind is so beautiful in that way. Sometimes it comes so natural to me, so easy to pay attention to the world fully, to other people fully. And sometimes the stress over silly things is overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting that the mind is that roller coaster in that way.
At stage 5, you discover how identity is constructed.
Self-offering.
Realize that your values are not terminal, but they are instrumental to achieving a world that you like and aesthetics that you prefer.
Yeah.
And the more you understand this, the more you get agency over how your identity is constructed. And you realize that identity in interpersonal interaction is a costume. And you should be able to have agency over that costume, right? It's useful to be a costume. It tells something to others and it allows to interface in roles. But being locked into this is a big limitation.
The word costume kind of implies that it's fraudulent in some way. Is costume a good word for you? Like
No.
we present ourselves to the world.
In some sense, I learned a lot about costumes at Burning Man. Before that, I did not really appreciate costumes and saw them more as uniforms, like wearing a suit if you are working in a bank or if you are trying to get startup funding from a VC in Switzerland. Right? Then you dress up in a particular way, and this is mostly to show the other side that you are willing to play by the rules and you understand what the rules are. But there is something deeper. When you are at Burning Man, your costume becomes self-expression, and there is no boundary to the self-expression. You're basically free to wear what you want, to express other people what you feel like this day, and what kind of interactions you want to have.
Is the costume a kind of projection of who you are?
That's very hard to say, because the costume also depends on what other people see in the costume. And this depends on the context that the other people understand. And so you have to create something, if you want to, that is legible to the other side, and that means something to yourself.
Do we become prisoners of the costume? Because everybody expects us
Some
to.
people do, but I think that once you realize that you wear a costume at Burning Man, a variety of costumes, realize that you cannot not wear a costume.
Yeah.
Right? Basically everything that you wear and present to others is something that is to some degree in addition to what you are deep inside.
So this stage, in parentheses, you put full adult, comma, wisdom. Why is this full adult? Why would you say this is full? And why is it wisdom?
It does allow you to understand why other people have different identities. from yours.
Ah.
And it allows you to understand that the difference between people who vote for different parties and might have very different opinions and different value systems is often the accident of where they are born and what happened after that to them, and what traits they got before they were born. And at some point you realize the perspective where you understand that everybody could be you in a different timeline if you just flip those bits.
How many costumes do you have?
I don't count, but in
More than one?
yeah, of course.
How easy is it to do costume changes throughout the day?
It's just a matter of energy and interest. When you are wearing your pajamas and you switch out of your pajamas into, say, a work short and pants, you're making a costume change, right? And if you are putting on a gown, you're making a costume change.
And you could do the same with personality?
You could, if that's what you're into. There are people which have multiple personalities for interaction in multiple worlds, right? So if somebody works in a store and you put up a storekeeper personality, when you're working, when you're presenting yourself at work, you develop a sub-personality for this. And the social persona for many people is in some sense a puppet that they're playing like a marionette. And if they play this all the time, they might forget that there is something behind this. There's something what it feels like to be in your skin. And I guess it's very helpful if you're able to get back into this. And for me, it's the other way around is relatively hard. For me, it's pretty hard to learn how to play consistent social roles. It's much easier just to be real.
Or not real, but to have
No, it's not quite the same. So basically when you are wearing a costume at Burning Man and say you are an extraterrestrial prince, there's something where you are expressing in some sense something that's closer to yourself than the way in which you hide yourself behind standard clothing when you go out in the city, in the default world. And so this costume that you're wearing at Burning Man allows you to express more of yourself, and you have a shorter distance of advertising to people what kind of person you are, what kind of interaction you would want to have with them. And so you get much earlier into medias res. And I believe it's regrettable that we do not use the opportunities that we have with custom-made clothing now to wear costumes that are much more stylish, that are much more custom-made, that are not necessarily part of a fashion in which you express which milieu you're part of and how up-to-date you are, but you also express how you are as an individual and what you want to do today and how you feel today and what you intend to do about it.
Well, isn't it easier now in the digital world to explore different costumes? I mean, that's the kind of idea with virtual reality. That's the idea, even with Twitter and two-dimensional screens. You can swap out costumes. You can be as weird as you want. It's easier. For Burning Man, you have to like order things. You have to make things. There's more effort to
It's
put
even
on.
better if you make them yourself.
Sure, but it's just easier to do digitally, right?
It's not about easy, it's about how to get it right. And
Sure.
for me, the first Burning Man experience, I got adopted by a bunch of people in Boston who dragged me to Burning Man, and we spent a few weekends doing costumes together. And it was an important part of the experience where the camp bonded, that people got to know each other, and we basically grew into the experience that we would have later.
So the extraterrestrial prince is based on a true story.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what that looks like. Yosha.
Okay.
Stage
so
6.
Stage 6. At some point, you can collapse the division between a personal self, and world generator again. And a lot of people get there via meditation, or some of them get there via psychedelics, some of them by accident. And you suddenly notice that you are not actually a person, but you are a vessel that can create a person. And the person is still there. You observe that personal self, but you observe the personal self from the outside. And you notice it's a representation. And you might also notice that the world that is being created is a representation. If not, then you might experience that I am the universe, I am the thing that is creating everything. And of course, what you're creating is not quantum mechanics and the physical universe. What you're creating is this game engine that is updating the world, and you're creating your valence, your feelings, your and all the people inside of that world, including the person that you identify with yourself in this world.
Are you creating the game engine, or are you noticing the game engine?
You noticed how you're generating the game engine. And I mean, when you are dreaming at night, you can, if you have a lucid dream, you can learn how to do this deliberately. And in principle, you can also do it during the day. And the reason why we don't get to do this from the beginning and why we don't have agency of our feelings right away is because we would game it before we have the necessary amount of wisdom to deal with creating this dream that we are in.
You don't want to get access to cheat codes too quickly, otherwise you won't enjoy.
So
the game.
stage 5 is already pretty rare, and stage 6 is even more rare. You basically find this mostly with advanced Buddhist meditators and so on that are dropping into this stage and can induce it at will and spend time in it.
So stage 5 requires a good therapist. Stage 6 requires a good Buddhist spiritual leader.
Yes, so it is, for instance, could be that is the right thing to do. But it's not that these stages give you scores or levels that you need to advance to. It's not that the next stage is better. You live your life in the mode that works best at any given moment, and when your mind decides that you should have a different configuration, then it's building that configuration. And for many people, they stay happily at stage 3 and experience themselves as part of groups, and there's nothing wrong with this. And for some people, this doesn't work, and they're forced to build more agency over their rational beliefs than this and construct their norms rationally. And so they go to this level. And stage 7 is something that is more or less hypothetical. That would be the stage in which it's basically a transhumanist stage, in which you understand how you work, in which the mind fully realizes how it's implemented, and can also, in principle, enter different modes in which it could be implemented. And that's the stage that, as far as I understand, is not open to people yet.
Oh, but it is possible through the process of technology.
Yes, and who knows if there are biological agents that are working at different time scales than us that basically become aware of the way in which they're implemented on ecosystems, and can change that implementation and have agency over how they're implemented in the world. And what I find interesting about the discussion about AI alignment, that it seems to be following these stages very much. Most people seem to be in stage 3, also according to Robert Keegan. I think he says that about 85% of people are in stage 3 and stay there. And if you're in stage 3 and your opinions are the result of social assimilation, then what you're mostly worried about in the AI is that the AI might have the wrong opinions. So if the AI says something racist or sexist, we are all lost because we will assimilate the wrong opinions from the AI. And so we need to make sure that the AI has the right opinions and the right values and the right structure. And if you're at stage 4, that's not your main concern. And so most nerds don't really worry about the algorithmic bias in the model that it picks up, because if there's something wrong with this bias, the AI ultimately will prove it. At some point, we'll get it there that it makes mathematical proofs about reality, and then it will figure out what's true and what's false. But you're still worried that the AI might turn you into paper clips because it might have the wrong values, right? So if it's set up with the wrong function that controls its direction in the world, then it might do something that is completely horrible, and there's no easy way to fix it.
So that's more like a stage 4 rationalist kind of worry.
And if you are at stage 5, you're mostly worried that the AI is not going to be enlightened fast enough, because you realize that the game is not so much about intelligence, but about agency, about the ability to control the future. And the identity is instrumental to this. And if you are a human being, I think at some level you ought to choose your own identity. You should not have somebody else pick the costume for you and then wear it, but instead you should be mindful about what you want to be in this world. And I think if you are an agent that is fully malleable, that can rewrite its own source code, like an AI might do at some point, then the identity that you will have is whatever you can be. And in this way, the AI will maybe become everything, like a planetary control system. And if it does that, then if we want to coexist with it, it means that it will have to share purposes with us. So it cannot be a transactional relationship. We will not be able to use reinforcement learning with human feedback to hardwire its values into it. But this has to happen is probably that it's conscious, so it can relate to our own mode of existence, where an observer is observing itself in real time and within certain temporal frames. And the other thing is that it probably needs to have some kind of transcendental orientation, building shared agency. And in the same way as we do when we are able to enter with each other into non-transactional relationships. And I find that something that, because the stage 5 is so rare, is missing in much of the discourse. And I think that we need, in some sense, focus on how to formalize love, how to understand love, and how to build it into the machines that we are currently building and that are about to become smarter than us.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to try to sneak up to the idea of enlightenment. So you wrote a series of good tweets about consciousness and panpsychism. So let's break it down. First, you say, I suspect the experience that leads to the panpsychism syndrome of some philosophers and other consciousness enthusiasts represents the realization that we don't end at the self, but share a resonant universe representation with every other observer coupled to the same universe. This actually eventually leads us to a lot of interesting questions about AI and AGI, but let's start with this representation. What is this resonant universe representation? And what do you think? Do we share such a representation?
The neuroscientist Rosberg has come up with a cognitive architecture that he calls the adaptive resonance theory. And his perspective is that our neurons can be understood as oscillators that are resonating with each other and with outside phenomena. So the coarse-grained model of the universe that we're building, in some sense, is a resonance with objects and outside of us in the world. So basically we take up patterns that of the universe that we are coupled with, and our brain is not so much understood as circuitry, even though this perspective is valid, but it's almost an ether in which the individual neurons are passing on chemoelectrical signals or arbitrary signals across all modalities that can be transmitted between cells, stimulate each other in this way, and produce patterns that they modulate while passing them on. And this speed of signal progression in the brain is roughly at the speed of sound, incidentally the time that it takes for the signals to hop from cell to cell. It means it's relatively slow with respect to the world. It takes an appreciable fraction of a second for a signal to go through the entire neocortex, something like 200 milliseconds. And so there's a lot of stuff happening in that time where the signal is passing through your brain, including in the brain itself. So nothing in the brain is assuming that stuff happens simultaneously. Everything in the brain is working in a paradigm where the world has already moved on and you are ready to do the next thing to your signal, including the signal processing system itself. It's quite a different paradigm than the one in our digital computers, where we currently assume that your GPU or CPU is pretty much globally in the same state.
So you mentioned there the non-dual state and say that some people confuse it for enlightenment.
Yeah.
What's the non-dual state?
There is a state in which you notice that you are no longer a person, and instead you are one with the universe.
So that speaks to the resonance.
Yes, but this one with the universe is, of course, not accurately modeling that you are indeed some god entity, or indeed the universe is becoming aware of itself, even though you get this experience. I believe that you get this experience because your mind is modeling the fact that you are no longer identified with the personal self in that state, but you have transcended this division between the self model and the world model, and you are experiencing yourself as your mind, as something that is representing a universe.
But that's still part of the model.
Yes. So it's inside of the model. Still, you're still inside of patterns that are generated in your brain and in your organism. And what you are now experiencing is that you're no longer this personal self in there, but you are the entirety of the mind and its contents.
Why is it so hard to get there?
A lot of people who get into this state think this, or are associated with enlightenment. I suspect it's a favorite training goal for a number of meditators. But I think that enlightenment is in some sense more mundane, and it's a step further or sideways. It's the state where you realize that everything is a representation.
Yeah, you say enlightenment is a realization of how experience is implemented.
Yes. Basically, you notice at some point that your qualia can be deconstructed.
Reverse engineered? What, like almost like a schematic of it? What?
you can start with looking at a face. And maybe look at your own face in a mirror.
Yeah.
Look at your face for a few hours in the mirror or for a few minutes. At some point it will look very weird, and because you notice that there's actually no face. You basically start unseeing the face. What you see is the geometry, and then you can assemble the geometry and realize how that geometry is being constructed in your mind. And you can learn to modify that. So basically you can change these generators in your own mind to shift the face around, or to change the construction of the face, to change the way in which the features are being assembled.
Why don't we do that more often? Why don't we start really messing with reality without the use of drugs or anything else? Why don't we get good at this kind of thing? Like, intentionally.
Why should we? Why would
Because you
want to do
can morph reality into something more pleasant for yourself. Just have fun with it.
Yeah, that is probably what you shouldn't be doing, right? Because outside of your personal self, this outer mind is probably a relatively smart agent. And what you often notice is that you have thoughts about how you should live, but you observe yourself doing different things and having different feelings. And that's because your outer mind doesn't believe you and doesn't believe your rational thoughts.
Well, can't you just silence the outer mind?
The thing is that the outer mind is usually smarter than you are. Rational thinking is very brittle. It's very hard to use logic and symbolic thinking to have an accurate model of the world. So there is often an underlying system that is looking at your rational thoughts and then tells you, no, you're still missing something. Your gut feeling is still saying something else. And this can be, for instance, you find a partner that looks perfect, or you find a deal when you build a company or whatever that looks perfect to you, and yet at some level you feel something is off and you cannot put your finger on it, and the more you reason about it, the better it looks to you, but the system that is outside still tells you, no, you're missing something.
And that system is powerful.
People call this intuition, right? Intuition is this unreflected part of your attitude composition and computation, where you produce a model of how you relate to the world and what you need to do it in it and what you can do in it and what's going to happen, that is usually deeper and often more accurate than your reason.
So if we look at this, as you write in the tweet, if we look at this more rigorously, as a sort of take the panpsychist idea more seriously, almost as a scientific discipline, you write that, quote, fascinatingly, the panpsychist interpretation seems to lead to observations of practical results to a degree that physics fundamentalists might call superstitious. Reports of long-distance telepathy and remote causation are ubiquitous in the general population. I am not convinced, says Yershabak, that establishing the empirical reality of telepathy would force an update of any part of serious academic physics, but it could trigger an important revolution in both neuroscience and AI from a circuit perspective to a coupled complex resonator paradigm. Are you suggesting that there could be some rigorous mathematical wisdom to panpsychist perspective on the world?
So first of all, panpsychism is the perspective that consciousness is inseparable from matter in the universe. And I find panpsychism quite unsatisfying because it does not explain consciousness, right? It does not explain how this aspect of matter produces it. It's also when I try to formalize panpsychism and write down what it actually means and with a more formal mathematical language, it's very difficult to distinguish it from saying that there is a software side to the world, in the same way as there is a software side to what the transistors are doing in your computer. So basically there's a pattern at a certain force graining of the universe that in some reasons of the universe leads to observers that are observing themselves. Right? So panpsychism maybe is not even, when I write it down, a position that is distinct from functionalism. But intuitively, a lot of people feel that the activity of matter itself, of mechanisms in the world, is insufficient to explain it, so it's something that needs to be intrinsic to matter itself. And you can, apart from this abstract idea, have an experience in which you experience yourself as being the universe, which I suspect is basically happening because you manage to dissolve the division between personal self and mind that you establish as an infant when you construct the personal self and transcend it again and understand how it works. But there is something deeper. That is that you feel that you're also sharing a state with other people. That you have an experience in which you notice that your personal self is moving into everything else. That you basically look out of the eyes of another person. That every agent in the world that is an observer is, in some sense, you.
So if
And we forget that we are the same agent.
So is it that we feel that, or do we actually accomplish it? So is telepathy possible? Is it real?
So for me, that is a question that I don't really know the answer to. In Turing's famous 1950 paper in which he describes the Turing test, he does speculate about telepathy, interestingly, and asks himself if telepathy is real, and he thinks that it very well might be, what it would be the implication for AI systems that try to be intelligent, because he didn't see a mechanism by which a computer program would become telepathic. And I suspect if telepathy would exist, or if all the reports that you get from people when you ask the normal person on the street, I find that very often they say, I have experiences with telepathy. The scientists might not be interested in this and might not have a theory about this, but I have difficulty explaining it away. And so you could say maybe this is a superstition, maybe it's a false memory, or maybe it's a little bit of psychosis, who knows? Maybe somebody wants to make their own life more interesting or misremembers something. But a lot of people report, I noticed something terrible happened to my partner, and I know this is exactly the moment it happened, where my child had an accident, and I knew that was happening, and the child was in a different town. Right? So maybe it's a false memory where this is later on mistakenly attributed, but a lot of people think that this is not the correct explanation. So if something like this was real, what would it mean? Probably would mean that either your body is an antenna that is sending information over all sorts of channels, like maybe just electromagnetic radio signals that you're sending over long distances, and you get attuned to another person that you spend enough time with to get a few bits out of the ether to figure out what this person is doing. Or maybe it's also when you are very close to somebody and you become empathetic with them. What happens is that you go into a resonance state with them, right? Similar to when people go into a seance and they go into a trance state and they start shifting a Ouija board around on the table. I think what happens is that their minds go via their nervous systems into a resonance state in which they basically create something like a shared dream between them.
Physical closeness or closeness broadly defined?
With physical closeness, it's much easier to experience empathy with someone, right? I suspect it would be difficult for me to have empathy for you if you were in a different town. Also, how would that work? But if you are very close to someone, you pick up all sorts of signals from their body, not just by your eyes, but with your entire body. And if the nervous system sits on the other side and the intercellular communication sits on the other side and is integrating over all these signals, you can make inferences about the state of the other. And it's not just the personal self that does this via reasoning, but your perceptual system. And what basically happens is that your representations are directly interacting. It's the physical resonant models of the universe that exist in your nervous system and in your body might go into resonance with others and start sharing some of their states. So you basically being next to somebody, you pick up some of their vibes and feel without looking at them what they're feeling in this moment. And it's difficult for you, if you're very empathetic, to detach yourself from it and have an emotional state that is completely independent from your environment. People who are highly empathetic are describing this. And now imagine that a lot of organisms on this planet have representations of the environment and operate like this, and they are all adjacent to each other and overlapping, so there's going to be some degree in which there is basically some chained interaction, and we are forming some slightly shared representation. And relatively few neuroscientists who consider this possibility. I think big rarity in this regard is Michael Levin, who is considering these things in earnest. And I stumbled on this train of thought mostly by noticing that the tasks of a neuron can be fulfilled by other cells as well. They can send different typed chemical messages and physical messages to their adjacent cells and learn when to do this and when not, make this conditional, and become universal function approximators. The only thing that they cannot do is telegraph information over axons very quickly over long distances, right? So neurons in this perspective are specially adapted kind of telegraph cell that has evolved so we can move our muscles very fast, but our body is in principle able to also make models of the world just much slower.
It's interesting, though, that at this time, at least in human history, there seems to be a gap between the tools of science and the subjective experience that people report, like you're talking about with telepathy. And it seems like we're not quite there.
No, I think that there is no gap between the tools of science and telepathy. Either it's there or it's not, and it's an empirical question. And if it's there, we should be able to detect it in a lab.
So why is there not a lot of Michael Levins walking around?
I don't think that Michael Levin is specifically focused on telepathy very much. He is focused on self-organization in living organisms and in brains, both as a paradigm for development and as a paradigm for information processing. And when you think about how organization processing works in organisms, there is first of all radical locality, which means everything is decided locally from the perspective of an individual cell. The individual cell is the agent. And the other one is coherence. Basically, there needs to be some criterion that determines how these cells are interacting in such a way that order emerges on the next level of structure. And this principle of coherence, of imposing constraints that are not validated by the individual parts and lead to coherent structure, to basically transcendental agency, where you form an agent on the next level of organization, is crucial in this perspective.
It's so cool that radical locality leads to the emergence of complexity at the higher layers.
And I think what Mike Levin is looking at is nothing that is outside of the realm of science in any way. It's just that he is a paradigmatic thinker who develops his own paradigm, and most of the neuroscientists are using a different paradigm at this point. And this often happens in science, that a field has a few paradigms in which people try to understand reality and build concepts and make experiments.
You're kind of one of those type of paradigmatic thinkers. Actually, if we can take a tangent on that, once again returning to the biblical verses of your tweets. You're right. My public explorations are not driven by audience service, but by my lack of ability for discovering, understanding, or following the relevant authorities. So, I have to develop my own thoughts. Since I think autonomously, these thoughts cannot always be very good. That's you apologizing for the chaos of your thoughts. Or perhaps not apologizing, just identifying.
Yeah,
but let me ask the question. Since we talked about Michael Levin and yourself, who I think are very kind of radical, big, independent thinkers, can we reverse engineer your process of thinking autonomously? How do you do it? How can you do it? How can you avoid being influenced by, stage 3?
Well, why would you want to do that? It's you see what is working for you, and if it's not working for you, you build another structure that works better for you, right? And so I found myself when I was thrown into this world in a state where my intuitions were not working for me. I was not able to understand how I would be able to survive in this world and build the things that I was interested in, build the kinds of relationship I needed to build, work on the topics that I wanted to make progress on. And so I had to learn. And for me, Twitter is not some tool of publication. It's not something where I put stuff that I entirely believe to be true and provable. It's an interactive notebook in which I explore possibilities. And I found that when I tried to understand how the mind and how consciousness works, I was quite optimistic. I thought there needs to be a big body of knowledge that I can just study and that works. And so I entered studies in philosophy and computer science, and later psychology and a bit of neuroscience and so on. And I was disappointed by what I found, because I found that the questions of how consciousness and how it works, how emotion works, how it's possible that the system can experience anything, how motivation emerges in the mind, were not being answered by the authorities that I met and the schools that were around. And instead, I found that it was individual thinkers that had useful ideas that sometimes were good, sometimes were not so good, sometimes were adopted by a large group of people, sometimes were rejected by large groups of people. But for me, it was much more interesting